Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I am your host of Killer Instinct. Before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday and you are not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well, so make sure you are subscribed. Now, you guys, as you can tell by the title of today's episode, today we have a crazy case. I told you guys last week that the true crime category for the month of August is all dedicated to female killers. Now, as you can tell by the title, today we are talking about a woman named Miranda Barbour. And Miranda Barbour captivated the nation when she confessed to murdering over 20 different people, and whether you believe that or not is going to be up to you to decide once we get through this episode. Now, one thing we do know for certain is that Miranda is responsible for the murder of a man named Troy Laferrera, and that is what we are going to be discussing today as well. So with that being said, let's jump right on into it today. Now, to begin this case, I want to start by talking about who Miranda Barbour is. Miranda Barbour was born on December 14th, 1994 in North Pole, Alaska, to her mother Elizabeth, her father Sonny, and she also had a sister named Ashley. Now, even though North Pole, Alaska isn't the actual North Pole that we hear about on Christmas, it definitely emulates the same feel with candy cane striped streetlights. There's a Santa Claus house, there's street names like Kris Kringle Drive, Mistletoe Lane, Snowman Lane, Holiday Road, and even some after Santa's reindeer. And the Christmas spirit never dies in North Pole, Alaska. That is how it is all year around. Now, when it comes to Miranda's childhood, when she was 2 years old, she was diagnosed with a condition called developmental dysplasia, which meant that her hips were not forming properly, and she had to wear leg braces for several years in order to try and repair this. Now, this really limited the activity that Miranda was allowed to do. She wasn't as active with the neighborhood kids. She wasn't playing with them as frequently as everyone else was because of her dysplasia, so she definitely felt isolated because of that. Now, luckily, Miranda did have a cousin who moved to town around the time that she was diagnosed with developmental dysplasia. Now, this cousin was the daughter of Elizabeth's sister. So Elizabeth, Miranda's mother, had a sister named Melissa. So Melissa, as well as her husband, Rick, so that would make that Miranda's uncle, as well as their daughter, who would be Miranda's cousin, all moved to the North Pole. And everyone was really excited about this. They were excited that they were going to have family in town. They were excited that Miranda and Ashley and their cousin were going to be able to grow up together and be able to hang out together. Because again, up until this point, Miranda was very limited in her social life and what she was able to do. So she was very excited when she learned that her cousin was moving to North Pole. Now, sadly, this really was the only positive to come out of this, the fact that Miranda and Ashley were able to be around their cousin, because behind closed doors, there was something horrific happening. There have been many reports of sexual abuse that Miranda had endured at the hands of her uncle Rick, and not just Miranda. It also was said to have happened to Ashley, as well as Rick's daughter, so Miranda and Ashley's cousin as well. And the details of this abuse are absolutely heinous. It has been said that the sexual abuse of Miranda began when she was only 3 years old, and she was sodomized. Miranda and Ashley would go over to their aunt and uncle's home quite frequently on the weekends. They would spend a lot of time there, and whenever Rick had the chance to be alone with the girls, he took advantage of it and would completely and utterly torture them. Now, when Ashley was 6 years old, so again, Miranda's sister, when she was 6 years old, she finally came out and told her mom, Elizabeth, about what was happening to her, Miranda, and and their cousin. And when Elizabeth heard this, she immediately went to Melissa, and the two of them raced over to the police department to file a report against Rick. Now, immediately when police heard this, they knew that they needed to act fast. They went over to Melissa and Rick's home, which is where they arrested Rick and presented a search warrant for the house as well. Now, while police were searching through the home, they discovered a manual that Rick had written, and this was called Fun with My Sister's Kids. And in this manual, Rick encouraged all male family members of any family to engage in sexual acts with their nieces, daughters, and granddaughters. Rick had also wrote about each and every abusive and torturous act that he had done to Miranda and Ashley in this manual as well. So it was almost as though he wanted to relive every single act that he had committed. Now, Rick was arrested, but insanely enough, the judge let him off easy. And it wasn't at the request of Miranda's family. Everyone in Miranda's family wanted the toughest and harshest sentence for Rick. However, the judge only sentenced him to 19 years in prison and only made him serve 10 years before he was released. Now, after the 10 years, when Rick was released, he remained in and out of prison for some time after this for violating his parole. And ultimately, after violating parole so many times, his sentence was raised to 40 additional years in prison. Now, at this point, Elizabeth, the mother of Miranda and Ashley, she decided that she wanted to move their family. That way they could have a new chapter, they could have a fresh start. She didn't want her kids to continue being raised in North Pole where all of these horrible things had happened to them. They really just wanted a chance to start over. And along with this, Elizabeth was also going through a pretty messy divorce with Miranda and Ashley's dad at this time. So she just wanted to get out of North Pole for good. And so because of that, she packed up both her daughters and the three of them moved to Palmer, Alaska. And while Elizabeth hoped again that this would be a fresh start for her and her daughters, it really just started a downward spiral for Miranda. By the time Miranda was 13 years old, she was running away for days and weeks at a time, and she also got herself involved in a satanic cult. She began experimenting with drugs and very soon became addicted to them. Along with the drugs she was also taking medication for her bipolar and schizophrenia that she had been diagnosed with. Now, according to Ashley, she claimed that at this time when Miranda was getting involved in the satanic cult, as well as when she was getting involved with experimenting in drugs, she claimed that their mom, Elizabeth, was very, very neglectful during this time. Miranda really had the free will to do whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted. And because of this, Miranda kept landing herself in more and more dangerous situations. By the time Miranda was 17 years old, she was giving herself to random men for money, which landed her pregnant at the age of 17. Now, Miranda claims that a lot of her acting out behavior was in the hopes that her mom would pay attention to her. She very much felt like her mom didn't care, so much so that Miranda even went to the lengths of writing a letter to the Dr. Phil show at one point, trying to get Dr. Phil to help mend her family. In this letter, she says, quote, "Dear Dr. Phil, ever since my parents got divorced, my mom has become a pill-popping drunk. She meets random men off the internet and has them come over. She also claims to have stage 3 cancer, but won't stop drinking or taking all of these pills. She doesn't care to live anymore, and she tells me and my sister that every day. I just want my mom, and I'm at a loss of how to help her." End quote. Now, at this time, Dr. Phil never saw this letter. However, it did attract the attention of the authorities when Dr. Phil producers were combing through the letters for their show. They saw this letter and thought that it was alarming enough to get the authorities involved, which they did. Now, when police got involved and CPS got involved, because remember, Miranda was 17 years old at the time, they deemed that Elizabeth was unfit to be a parent at this particular point. And so because of that, Miranda was sent off to North Carolina to live with her extended family in 2011. And remember, she was 17 at this time and still pregnant. Now, while living in North Carolina, Miranda began socializing and meeting different people, and this is when she met a man named Elliot Barbour. Elliot Barbour was born on November 11th, 1991, and he grew up in North Carolina. Elliot was 20 years old at the time that he met Miranda, and he also had a girlfriend named Amy, who was also pregnant. Now, when Elliot and Miranda first met, the two became very close, and Elliot then introduced Miranda to his girlfriend Amy, who Miranda also became very close with. They had a lot in common, they were both pregnant, and they really leaned on each other for support during this time. And over time, there was an odd friendship slash love triangle that was happening between the three of them. It was very clear that Elliot liked Miranda, but he also liked Amy. Miranda also liked Elliot. It was a very complex relationship that the three of them had, but again, they all really leaned on each other for support. Amy and Miranda ended up having their children 2 months apart. They both gave birth to daughters, and they all continued spending time together and navigating through the newborn phase and this new phase of life together, leaning on each other through that time. Now, specifically, Elliot and Miranda really bonded during this period, and they had a lot in common. One of those things was that they had both been diagnosed with schizophrenia. It was something that they talked about, and they, again, bonded over the fact that this was something that they shared. Now, Elliot also had a substance abuse problem, and that led into a drinking problem as well. And all in all, this began being too much for Amy at this time. She didn't want her daughter exposed to Elliot's behavior, and she just wanted better for herself as well as her child. And so because of this, she ended up breaking up with Elliot and she moved out of the house, which left Elliot and Miranda together. And again, within days of Amy leaving Elliot, Elliot and Miranda were already officially a couple. Both of them were deeply intrigued with each other, and like I mentioned, they had a lot of common interests, one of which was Satanism. They would read all about Satanism and the different rituals that they could practice together. They would also tell friends that they engage in satanic sex together. And when Miranda was 18, her and Elliot finally decided to officially get married. And shortly after that, the two of them, along with Miranda's daughter, made the move from North Carolina to Pennsylvania to start a fresh new chapter as a family. Now, upon moving, they realized very quickly that they were going to need to make money and fast. Neither of them had a job, so collectively, they decided that Miranda was going to put an ad out on Craigslist. Now, this was not anything new for Miranda. As I mentioned earlier, she had given herself away to men for money. She had engaged in different sex work. She had used ads such as Craigslist before. So this wasn't anything that was new to her. In the ad that she put out on Craigslist, Miranda said, quote, "female companionship in exchange for money," and charged $100. Now, multiple people responded to Miranda's ad that she posted. There were many people who were online seeking out exactly what Miranda was offering. One of those being a 42-year-old man named Troy Laferrera. Troy was born on June 20th, 1971 to his parents, Harriet and Thomas, and he has a sister named Holly. Troy grew up in Port Trevorton, Pennsylvania, and attended Pennsylvania State University, and while there, earned his degree in civil engineering. Afterwards, he then went on to earn his professional engineering license, as well as his professional land surveyor's license. In Troy's free time, he was incredibly passionate about hunting. It was something that he would spend weeks on end preparing for each season every single year. When he wasn't hunting, he loved target shooting or watching TV shows about hunting. Now, Troy was married. That's something I do want to point out in this case. He was married. He did have a wife named Colleen, and the two of them got married on June 11th, 2011, after 8 years of being together. So at the time that Troy was seeking out this ad on Craigslist, he was in fact in a marriage. So, obviously, with this being said, this means that Troy was cheating on his wife. And this was not the first time that Troy was said to have done something like this. It was alleged that Troy engaged in multiple adulterous affairs throughout the duration of his relationship and his marriage. However, I do want to disclaim, and I feel like this is a very basic thing to say and might be a no duh kind of thing to say. Obviously, despite whatever Troy was doing online, despite the decisions that he was making, as wrong as they might be and as wrong as they morally were, the consequence of those decisions do not equate to what ended up happening to him. Regardless of anything, Troy did not deserve what I'm about to tell you he ended up going through. So it's clear to say that this was not Miranda's first time doing something like this, and this was also not Troy's first time doing something like this. However, what Troy did not know is that Miranda had other plans that night, and it didn't involve female companionship. Miranda had very different plans for how her and Troy were going to spend their time together, and that plan was murder. Now, once Troy responded to Miranda's Craigslist ad, him and Miranda began exchanging messages over the app, and that is when they decided that they were going to meet in a mall parking lot on November 11th, 2013, which coincidentally enough is Elliot's birthday. So on November 11th, Miranda met Troy at the Susquehanna Valley Mall parking lot located in Hummel's Wharf, Pennsylvania. Upon meeting, Troy got into the passenger seat of the car where he handed Miranda over the $100 pavement, and the two of them drove for 6 miles to Sunbury, Pennsylvania, which Miranda told Troy was for the reason so that the two of them could have a little bit more privacy. Now, what Troy did not know is that him and Miranda were not the only two people in this car, and that Elliot was also in the car as well, in the back seat, hiding underneath blankets. Now, once Miranda finally drove out the 6 miles, she put her car in park, and that is when her and Troy began having a conversation. They began chit-chatting a little bit, and Elliot was in the back waiting for Miranda to say the code sentence. Prior to meeting Troy, Elliot and Miranda talked about their plan for the night and how Elliot was going to wait for the code sentence, which was, "Have you seen the stars tonight?" Now, once Elliot heard Miranda say that code sentence, "Have you seen the stars tonight?" that is when he jumped out from underneath the blanket in the back seat and ambushed Troy by strangling him from behind with a TV cable. While Elliot was doing that, that is when Miranda took out a knife and began stabbing Troy 20 times, over and over and over. Miranda stabbed Troy in the groin, the neck, his chest, his stomach, all over his body. Now, once Troy had ultimately succumbed to the stabbing and died, that is when Miranda and Troy took his body and placed it in the backyard of a residential property before stealing $150 of cash out of Troy's wallet, which they then used to have dinner that night at the local Red Robin restaurant. So technically, Troy paid for their dinner that night after they murdered him. And then after Red Robin, the two went to Walmart to buy cleaning supplies to clean out the car, and they went to the strip club to celebrate Elliot's birthday later that evening. Now, the following morning on November 12th, Troy's body was discovered and police were immediately called to the scene. Now, when police arrived, they said that the first thing that they noticed was how vicious and brutal the murder of Troy was. Now, Troy did have his cell phone still on him, and police were able to look through the cell phone and discovered that the last phone call that Troy had made on his phone was to Miranda's number. That is how they were initially able to connect Miranda and Troy together. Along with that, they also looked into Troy's browser history, and they saw the multiple websites that Troy was using in order to chat and contact other women. It was through that they saw the Craigslist messages between Troy and Miranda and how they had planned to meet later that night on November 11th. So because of the last phone call that Troy made being to Miranda, as well as the Craigslist messages back and forth, police knew that they needed to speak to Miranda about what exactly happened on November 11th. They were able to track down Miranda and they brought her down to the police station for questioning. Now, initially, not only did Miranda say that she had absolutely nothing to do with Troy's murder, she had never met Troy before, she didn't know how he died, she also went as far as to say that she never even met Troy. According to Miranda, her story was that her and Troy made plans to meet up at the local Denny's. However, the meeting never happened because Troy never showed up. She claimed time and time again that she never met Troy before, and things really began escalating between Miranda and the detective after the detective told her that they were going to seize Miranda's phone and look through it. Once the detective told Miranda this, Miranda became extremely upset, saying that she was very offended that they were insinuating that she would do something like this. She claimed that she just got married to Elliot, there was no reason for her to murder him, XYZ, and ultimately she did leave the police station because police didn't have enough evidence at this point to prove that Miranda actually killed Troy. Everything was circumstantial up until this point, and after speaking to Miranda, police then brought Elliot in for more questions. Now, it's important to note how the police approached talking to Elliot at this time because in their minds, at this specific moment, Miranda was the only person responsible. They had no evidence to prove that Elliot was somehow tied to this or there when Troy's murder happened. They strictly were bringing Elliot in at this point just to talk to him about what he knew about Miranda and Troy's relationship, what Miranda did on the night of the 11th. They weren't suspicious of Elliot really at all at this point. Now, when Elliot sat down with these detectives, he was insisting from the very beginning that Miranda never met up with Troy. He went on to say that Miranda does this from time to time. She meets men on the internet for money. However, it's strictly companionship and for these men to have conversations with Miranda, and that it never gets past the point of being anything physical. It never leads to sex. It never leads to any sort of physical relationship. He claimed that these men were depressed and lonely and sad and didn't like their current lives, and they were looking for a younger girl to have some sort of companionship with, and that it was more so for the emotional stimulation and the mental stimulation than anything else. Now, while Elliot was saying all of this, police were actually very quick to correct him and say that Miranda and Troy did actually meet on the night of the 11th. They told Elliot that despite what Miranda is telling him, they have proof that Troy and Miranda did meet up on the night of the 11th. Now, when detectives told Elliot this, he acted somewhat surprised. He said that he was going to have a chat with Miranda when he got home later that night to be able to sort things out and really talk this through because he was very surprised that his wife would do that. And after that conversation, Elliot was dismissed from the police station and he went home as well. Now, I want to talk about Elliot and Miranda's living situation at this point in time because Elliot, Miranda, as well as Miranda's daughter, they were living with a friend of theirs at the time, and this friend was named Shay. So Shay was really housing Elliot, Miranda, and their daughter. Later that night, after Miranda had initially spoken with authorities, she went back to Shay's house, and her and Shay were having a conversation about what she was talking about with the police. And this is when Miranda actually confided in Shay and confessed to her that the police were actually right and that she did stab Troy to death. Now, at this point, Shay was completely taken aback. She claims that she didn't really know if Miranda was kidding initially or not. However, after realizing that Miranda was completely serious about what she was saying, Shay really tried to persuade Miranda and told Miranda that she needed to go turn herself in to the authorities. And after some convincing, Miranda ultimately agreed. It's unclear exactly what the details of this conversation were, if Shay actually threatened Miranda by saying that if you don't go to the police, I will. Those details are unclear. However, what we do know is that 7 hours after that initial police interview between Miranda and the authorities, Miranda arrived back at the police station to confess to the murder. However, she did bring police a story that they were not expecting. Now, from the very moment that Miranda sat down with authorities this second time around, she told them and was really trying to paint the picture that she murdered Troy as an act of self defense. She claimed that Troy had tried to strangle her and she needed to fight back and ultimately had to kill him in order to get him to stop. Miranda also told police that she typically keeps 3 different knives in her car at all times. So while Troy was strangling her, she just reached for the closest knife and began stabbing him. She claimed she stabbed him once, however, that did not do anything. So then she continued stabbing him until he stopped, which ended up being 20 times, murdering him. Now, at first, police thought that this story could be true. There was no evidence at this point to prove that this story wasn't true. Did it seem a little out there? Yes. However, there was no proof, evidence, anything to show that Miranda was lying about this. However, that was until police looked into CCTV street footage. In the CCTV footage, police saw Miranda parking her car in Sunbury. And again, this is the area that she drove with Troy to be a little bit more secluded and to be a little bit more private. This is where she parked her car, and security cameras have a very clear view of Miranda's car and the inside of it. Now, in the footage, you see Miranda and Troy in the front seat of the car. However, police were also shocked to see Elliot in the back seat. Now, the inside light of Miranda's car did turn on at a certain point because at one point in time, Troy did try to escape the car. However, Elliot got out of the car and pushed him back in. But again, that inside light was on, really giving police a clear view of what exactly was happening here, which was that Miranda was stabbing Troy over and over and over again, all while Elliot was restraining him. Now, at this point, police have the evidence to prove that Miranda is lying. This was not an act of self-defense. However, they also have the evidence to prove that Elliot was also there, which was something that they did not suspect up until that point. Now, at this time, police went to Shay's house where Elliot was staying, knocked on the door. Elliot opens the door. Police tell him that they are there for his arrest, and that is when he looked at police smoking a cigarette and said, quote, "I guess this is my last cigarette as a free man," end quote. Afterwards, police then brought Elliot down to the station and sat down with him for his second interrogation, and Elliot did not hold anything back in this interrogation, and he confessed to everything. He admitted that him and Miranda planned on murdering someone on his birthday, despite her claim of self-defense. He claimed that even though Miranda was luring men with her Craigslist ads promising sex, that was never the intention, and it was just a part of their murder plot. Elliot said that the whole intention from the beginning was to murder Troy. He explained how he hid in the back seat and strangled Troy with the TV cable. During his confession, he almost seems proud of what he did. There's a certain tone of what he's saying that makes it appear as if he is bragging about what him and Miranda have done. It's almost as if he's excited to talk about it. He did not have an ounce of remorse in his tone whatsoever. He then went on to explain that him and Miranda went out to dinner at Red Robin afterwards and stated that he got the burger and unlimited fries and that it was delicious. Now, at this point, both Elliot and Miranda were arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Troy, and they both pled not guilty despite Elliot's confession. I do want to say that up until this point, Miranda still was not budging about where she stood in this case. She was still claiming that it was self-defense, even though Elliot was very clear and the CCTV footage was very clear that that was not the case. Now, the initial motive that was placed during this first-degree murder charge was financial gain because of the $150 that Miranda and Elliot stole from Troy. However, the true motive of this case did not seem like financial gain whatsoever. They were not after Troy for his money. Elliot said it very clear. They wanted to kill someone just because they wanted to murder someone. And that's where I think this case differs from a lot of other cases that we talk about, because when we look at the motives of a lot of other cases that we see, the motives involve sex, money, cheating, affairs. Rarely do we see cases where someone is murdered quite simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Opportunistic kills are just not something that we see very often in the cases that we look at. The most common cases that we see more of an opportunistic killing are the serial killer cases that we look at, which really leads us to the next big question mark in this case, and part of the reason that this case became national media headline. Now, while Miranda was in jail and awaiting her trial, she got in contact with a specific journalist. And while talking to this journalist, she confessed that this was not the first time that she had murdered someone. When speaking to the journalist, she claimed that she had killed at least 22 people. And if this were true, this would make Miranda one of the most dangerous female serial killers of all time. And remember, at this point in time, she was only 19 years old. Now, Miranda went on to tell this journalist that when she was 12 years old, she joined a satanic gang and got involved in drugs. She claimed that this was a cult based around Satanism, and her other cult members were coerced into killing people. She claimed that her very first murder happened when she was 13 years old. She claimed that the leader of this cult lured a man out into the woods and shot this man without killing him. She then claims that the cult leader then gave Miranda the gun and forced her to shoot the fatal shot. Miranda went on to say that this was only the beginning, and that her and other cult members continued killing, and that there were bodies all over the United States. Specifically, she claimed that there were bodies in Alaska, California, Texas, and Florida, even though she's only ever reported living in Pennsylvania and Alaska. Now, Miranda also stated that in her defense, she claimed that the people that she was murdering were who she deemed to be bad people. So she thought in her mind that she was doing something good for society by getting rid of these bad people. For Troy's case specifically, she stated that she decided that she was going to murder Troy after she told Troy that she was 16 years old instead of 18 years old. And after telling him that, he said that he was okay with it and he had no problem. And it was at that point that she decided that she needed to kill him because clearly he was not a morally sound person at that time. Now, again, this goes against her claim of self-defense, and it also goes against Elliot's claim of saying that that was never a part of the plan. They were going to murder Troy regardless of his answer to that question. Now, police did speak with Elliot separately about Miranda's claim of murdering 22 people, potentially and allegedly. And according to Elliot, he claimed 100% without a doubt he believed it to be the truth. He went on to say that he would tell his friends that he believed Miranda was possessed. He said that whenever Miranda was possessed by what he claimed to be a demon, she would become Super Miranda, and Super Miranda would be the one who would kill these 22 people. Now, the FBI did get involved in this case to see if there was any merit or any basis of truth to these claims of murdering 22 people. However, they did not find any evidence to suggest that any of this was true. Even Miranda's father came out and claimed that Miranda was not a serial killer, but he did coin her to be a serial liar. Now, I do want to mention, and this is very full circle considering the letter that was sent in the beginning that we talked about from Miranda to Dr. Phil. Dr. Phil actually had Miranda's mom and her sister Ashley on the show. Now, while on the show, they both came to Miranda's defense and claimed that Miranda was influenced by Elliot, which was what led to the murder. And they also do not believe that Miranda was responsible for killing over 22 people. And again, Miranda claimed that to be the low end of the spectrum of how many people she claimed to have murdered. She said that she stopped counting over 22. Now, regardless of whether or not you believe those claims, both Elliot and Miranda were still charged and found guilty of the murder of Troy. And because of that, they were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in September of 2014. Now, that, you guys, is the case of Miranda Barbour. It's the murder of Troy Laferrera. I'm so curious to hear what you guys have to say about this case, whether or not you believe that Miranda did kill 22 people, if you believe that Troy was her first murder, if you believe that there is truth to the claims that she made, I'm curious to know what you have to say about it. But with that being said, you guys, that is all for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah. I'm your host of Killer Instinct. As always, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss it. I'll be back next week with a brand new one for you guys. And until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.